I'm not here to tell people what to think, but I do want them to think critically.
What is the single biggest strategic mistake Washington could make right now?
I would actually say it is an agreement with the Islamic Republic.
Negotiations don't happen in a vacuum. They sit on a top of military reality. We have seen reports of U.S. personnel repositioning in the region. When that happens, what a stage of escalation are we realistically in? And you also mentioned embassies reduce staff, but commercial flights continue. How should we interpret that signal? Is that precaution or preparation?
At this point in time, 46, 47 years later, particularly after the protests that we saw in January 2026, sitting down with the Islamic Republic is quite possibly the worst thing because it would be seen as legitimization.
If you could design the optimal outcome from this moment forward, what would it look like as an analyst that you have depth of knowledge about what's going on?
Unfortunately, cleverly, the Islamic Republic is doing, through its indirect and limited engagement, it is trying to signal back home to the population that, hey, you know that guy who was trying to help you? He's more interested in talking to me. And the goal of this strategically is the Islamic Republic knows it cannot fight a two-front war.
You mentioned a very critical point. Reading about history is as important, if not more important, than current events.
Khamenei, the supreme leader, has been saying for so many years, there will never be a war, nor will we negotiate with America. Then it turned out, yes, there was a war, and now they are negotiating with America.
When demands are absolute, 0% enrichment, does that make the talks more about positioning than compromise?
That also comes with a cost for the president, because every single comment he made in those 8 or 9 comments in the month of January have to do with supporting protesters rather than with the nuclear issue. So therefore, there is no nuclear off-ramp you can easily take to this crisis, which is about credibility and is about how you promise support to, again, these protesters. And the president is now trying to touch that issue again by mentioning the number. 32,000 was the number that he mentioned in the State of the Union.
Historically, Tehran has used negotiations to buy time. Based on the patterns you have studied, are we watching that again?
The fact that we are all here now, 46, 47 years later, and we've kind of come down to this host of really bad options, including, by the way, to the point where, the most nationalistic thing to do, I think, at this point in time is to talk about the military option.
Is there any proof that they haven't moved over 60%, 400 kg, 60% enriched uranium, and they haven't turned that into 90%, which is not that difficult technically? Is there a proof that they haven't done that?
If you are the regime and you're buying time against a very costly backdrop, against a president who has a precedent of sticking to in an almost legalistic manner, sticking to a pre-approved clock for diplomacy.
What message does it send, to Russia and China if U.S. back down and make a deal with Islamic regime? Not only that, what message it sends to allies and rogue regimes, like North Korea, So because the U.S. military is built for a reason.
We are conceiving of this as a campaign rather than an operation. But just to get to the imagery of war for a second, it is more important that Khamenei's bait, the office, not exist than Khamenei to not exist. The imagery of that is very critical if you are trying to use street air power to drive street protests, to be able to pincer security forces so you can drill down and they can force defections from the bottom.
Welcome back. Today on Beyond the Summit, we are joined by one of the most serious and sharp analysts on Iran's military doctrine, missile program, and regional strategy. Behnam Taleblu is Senior Director of the Iran Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. For years, he has tracked the Islamic regime's nuclear advances, ballistic missile expansion, proxy warfare networks, and the strategic mindset that drives Tehran's decisions. He has testified before lawmakers in the U.S., Canada, and U.K., authored in-depth research on Iran's missile arsenal, and become a trusted voice when policymakers need clarity, not noise. But today is not just about policy. It's about how someone becomes an expert on one of the most dangerous regimes in the world. It's about the strategy, deterrence, diplomacy, and meaning of freedom. And it's about what may happen next. Behnam, welcome to Beyond the Summit. It's great to have you.
Great to be with you. Thank you, Amir. Well, then, very kind of you.
Behnam, this is a serious moment in history. And before we unpack the strategy and military positioning, I want people to understand the person behind the analysis. You have dedicated years to studying the Islamic regime at a level most people never do. That kind of focus usually comes from something deeper than academic interest. What first pulled you into this as a life's work?
Well, you're absolutely right to put the finger on how sometimes the personal is the professional and how the professional can become the personal. There's an old saying, love what you do, never work a day in your life. That kind of makes work your life, but your life your work. And when I was growing up, I'm a first generation Iranian American. What always struck me was the dissonance between the Iran in the news or the Iran on TV and just the Iran in our household or with our friends or with our family. I was a first generation Iranian American growing up in New York City. And obviously, at the time, you got to live through the multiple crises that made Iran increasingly a front page issue, whether that was the protests, domestic reform, terrorism, the global war on terror, 9/11, the nuclear issue, regional wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And all the rest, really. Most importantly for me, I was a kid that was a nerd, an absolute nerd. I wanted to be something between an archaeologist and potentially go look at these historical sites in Iran that were less popular and excavate. And then I wanted to be a cab driver. Then I wanted to be a marine biologist. But moral of the story is when I was young and being super interested in history, mostly ancient, but then increasingly contemporary, I learned about Iran through that lens. And I also learned about the current job that I have through that lens. I used to watch a lot of public access TV, a lot of C-SPAN, and I saw at the height of all these different issues, not just with Iran, not just with Israel, not just with America, but with the whole U.S. Middle East, the whole post-Cold War American engagement. I saw these people who were authors, professors, scholars in these places called think tanks, writing books, writing articles, trying to contribute to something that I believe in very, very much, which is the idea of the informed citizen. And that everybody deserves to know. It's not just the professor who deserves to know. Everyone deserves to know. We must know. And so I kind of made it my mini mission in life to know, to get smart on how did we get here? What happened that got us here? What brought Iran to this point? Why is it that so many Iranians are abroad? These questions were social and professional and personal at the same time. And then I was lucky enough to be able to build a career off of that. I've been in Washington now 19 years, in FDD now 13 years. But it really all started with those series of questions and seeing at least that there was a job or at least an industry that would allow you to ask those questions and then also make the answers valid for where you live and work, and that is the United States of America.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. It clearly shows how your curiosity become, a purpose for you. So, and when you look back at your early years, was there a defining moment, maybe something personal or intellectual that shaped how you see the regime today?
Shaped? No. I mean, there's all these little flashes in the pan of how you come to know about Iran. It's more like a kaleidoscope than just one thing. One was, of course, this might sound really odd, but on VHS cassettes, we used to get one of these VHS cassettes every year growing up for Persian New Year. I think I was 4 or 5. And in the middle of the cassette, which had all these comedy skits and poetry readings and things that we would put for the Nowruz holiday in March, there was like a 5 minute splice or a cut to a speech by the exiled crown prince. And at that time, I didn't even know Iran had a king or a monarchy. I was 4 or 5. And I remember my
Right.
father telling me that there was a very different kind of Iran. And so that got me a little bit curious because it looked a lot different than the Iran that you would see on TV. Then the next thing was when I was in sixth grade, actually, we had to do a report on where you were from, where your family was from. I mean, some people had so much, God bless them, diversity on the side of their grandparents that they had to do like 10 reports. They were all over the place. I just, did one, Iran. It was, again, I was very young, but was kind of forced to learn why is there, I first was able to touch this tension. Why is there this feeling of greatness and why is there this present condition of anything but greatness? And so
Right.
that I remember that writing that book report, and that I still have that book report somewhere up until when my parents retired. That got me, always very curious. And then coming and living and working in Washington and seeing that the debates were not as simple, even though they didn't appear to be simple, as they were presented on TV, coming up close, going to think tank events, meeting people, forcing them to get coffees with you. I really came of age by having so many people be so generous with their time. So it's not just one issue, but I got to learn about the issue through family experiences, assignments in school, and then my own young adult curiosity. And so it wasn't just like one flash in the pan moment. It was really a host of things that got me interested and kept me interested.
Yeah, great. I love that. So definitely there has been an evolution. Every serious expert evolves over time, as you clearly mentioned that. Early in your career, what did you misunderstand about Iran that you later corrected?
Well, certainly, again, I was just preteen, but looking at the how much attention, how much ink was spilt on the decade and a half of the reform movement. The older folks were always very grudging of this. Listening to conversations in the I'm going to give away the story here, but my father was in the carpet trade for many years. And just listening to the conversations and the sheer skepticism of anything even remotely being possible socially within Iran. And then just as a kid, and especially as an American kid, always the first step you put forward is optimism. Like, oh, well, why wouldn't it work? And then you have to learn to begin. You have to begin to learn about the state. You have to begin to learn about what kind of a force were the clergy in Iran and for 500 years. You have to begin to learn about all of Iran's layered security forces. I mean, these are things people didn't have from the get-go in D.C., let alone a young adult first generation kid in New York. But I remember seeing how the news was very optimistic, and then you would want to become optimistic, and then seeing how the kind of the grayed out generation, the original zero generation immigrants, the people who came here themselves, were always very skeptical. And I always kind of wondered why. And unfortunately now, fast forward all these years, you know exactly why. There's the delta between those two things is very huge. And now, we can rightly be critical of how some of the media unfortunately projects their view rather than uses their lens to tell you what is going on so that you can actually have a view. I'm not here to tell people what to think, but I do want them to think critically about the situation. And I think the over optimism I remember for that decade and a half, maybe it was because it was coterminous with me coming of age. It feels more magnified than it should be. But I think that was when, yeah, look at Iranians. Like Iranians were voting in a system. Look at the oxymoron. Iranians were voting in a system that was a closed system, an Islamist autocracy. The rates of participation, even though it didn't matter, were higher than some Western democracies. So the
Right.
fact that we are all here now, 46, 47 years later, and we've kind of come down to this host of really bad options, including, by the way, to the point where, the most nationalistic thing to do, I think, at this point in time is to talk about the military option. But look how we got here. Between the optimism of the media, the pessimism of the older generation, one thing I see in between is just this space being littered with the Iranian people trying everything to avoid getting to this point, and then the Iranian government kind of in real time, you would see it, not budging meaningfully at every juncture. So, I mean, here we are. Here's where we find
Right.
ourselves.
So this Islamic regime, if they're doing something really good, it's manipulation, deception, and lying not only to people in Iran but to the whole world. That's why we are here exactly. So Behnam, you've been immersed in high stakes analysis for years, studying conflict and threat daily. Can wear people down. How do you protect your own mental sharpness and resilience?
Well, I feel like I'm talking to my mother because she says I'm not doing too well these days because no one is sleeping, obviously.
Right.
Even if you just, if there was no protest, so that wouldn't wear on you emotionally. If there was no urgent war threat, so that wouldn't be, in the background. But just the day to day of going to these websites, I mean, you start your day with Vatane Emruz or Fatih Figan or Kehan. You're not going to be starting your day off on the right foot. So you are correct to say that again, I would never say I'm an expert, but I'm someone who studies this because expertise is something you can't just like put it there on a shelf and admire it. Every day you have to refine it. It has to be routinized. If I don't follow what's going on in Iran for 3 days, I'm behind actually 2 months. Whereas here in DC, where I live and work, you can not pay what's going attention, for a week, and then you can be caught up to speed in about less than a week. That's how fast things are moving, both from the state level and from society inside Iran. So it's our job to push ourselves to the max to try to find out as much as possible. And it's taxing. And it's even harder because my downtime stuff, I love to listen to podcasts. I put them on while I cook or when I go for long walks or even when I'm trying to go to bed. Sometimes I can try to multitask podcast in a different language, typing in a different language. I love to read, especially about the region, especially still about Iran. I mean, for fun, I'll read, again, more history than current policy stuff. That can also kind of make it hard. But the real answer is that you can't be guarded, that it's not a 9 to 5, that there isn't this artificial firewall that I can turn it on and turn it off. And especially because this stuff tugs at just not the head, but at the heart for you. So you do get damaged. Sleep does get lost. You do get very worrisome. It can be anxiety inducing. This is very real. To pretend to make a career talking about guns and bombs and authoritarian repression and street protests and a potential region-wide conflict, it should not be a cakewalk for people. If it is, I think they're the ones who
Right.
have something to atone for. But you just have to guard your soul. That's the one thing. You can never lose yourself in any of this. So there's the analyst, but also there's the person. And this is not stuff that you get to make colorful, but you try to bring as much of yourself to the situation as you can. And then once you know what yourself is, then you can afford to detach and say, what are the facts before I bring myself? Because sometimes people think it's a firewall and then they do an injustice to both. But I know you were talking more practically, and that means I need to sleep more, eat less, drink less coffee, and just be a better friend to everybody that I haven't been able to see because of the news cycle. But nonetheless, it has been hard. And I'm sure
Right.
this is a walk in the park compared to what you and I are doing compared to what the people in Iran are doing. But it is hard to guard yourself from that.
Absolutely. So you mentioned a very critical point. Reading about history is as important, if not more important, than current events. In one of your programs, you mentioned, the Last Shah books by Ray Tekia. After you recommended that book, I started reading that. Are there a couple of other books for someone who wants to know more about foundational kind of knowledge about Iran, which is not biased, which is less biased, let's say, and then more information that you can rely on?
Yeah, everybody has a bias, but I think one that does a good service to history. And I did a book review of this, I think, in 2014. The book is called Days of God by James Buchan. He's British. He used to write for The Guardian many years ago. When we talk about Iran books, it doesn't come up a lot, but it really should. I think it's a great cover of the 20th of Iran, really told, even though it's a history book, it's told through its national history, told through the prism of three different biographies chronologically. Reza Shah, Mohammad Reza Shah, Ruhollah Khomeini. Just in this spectrum, you actually cover one full century. And then you really understand how personality is power and the effects of personality on politics. But it's also just an elegantly written book, delves quite a bit into Persian sources and archival sources as much as other narrative histories. So it does a good academic balance there. And it just because it doesn't get mentioned a lot, I'd love to mention it. So, and if you're interested, first, I did a book review of it in 2014. I recommend folks check out the review. And if you like the review, I highly recommend you get the book. But it's called Days of God. And that's, again, modern history. But there's tons of other great books, too. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff back here I'd be happy to recommend. Also, some stuff I'd be happy not to recommend.
Sure. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for that. For young analysts watching this who want to do meaningful geopolitical work, what habits or discipline truly matter?
First, I would say discipline matters. The challenge with this work, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, is the skill set and the ability to apply the skill set over time. So I mentioned earlier, looking at some of the news, that can be something boring. But actually, it is the daily grind of getting the primary source material, getting the foreign language material, being able to be a good open source exploiter, whether that's in the traditional media space, HTML, social media, or anything else, being able to sift, to have enough knowledge so that once you encounter something, you can sift out what is signal, what is noise, what is new versus what is part of a pre-existing trend or pattern. So, one is that, refine your skills before you get to the issue. Two is actually when you get there, realize that it's not like this big glorious thing. It is the day-to-day slug that actually helps you produce greater information. Like I remember I did a big report. I think the one you mentioned, it's a monograph actually. I think it's the biggest printed thing FDD has published. It's called Arsenal.
It's over 120 pages. Yeah, I've read that. That's beautiful.
And
Great
it
work that
took
you've done.
3 years, but it was based on 8 years of research. And it's not, particularly novel, but it's about going into the open source, taking A plus B plus C plus D. And these are all open source unclassified. But when you get it and it equals E, you're like, this is very interesting. And that's the unique contribution analysts can make. It's to take what is out there, what is existing, looking at the material, not what other analysts saying, going to the actual primary source, spending enough time engaging with it, and repeating that process so many times that you can tell the trends, you can tell what's new, you can tell what's evolving. So it is exactly this. It's a behavior, it's a skill set. And having the discipline to apply that, I think, is very key. It doesn't have to be Iran, doesn't have to be security. It could be anything that you're interested in, water, environment, just having that discipline, applying it, you will see the story present itself. And the more you know about the situation, the easier you can find these trends and patterns. Many, many years ago, someone told me this work is like archaeology because you are sifting through something where you have context as to what that civilization was, but you find a piece of broken pottery. How do you know what the value of this was if you don't know enough about that civilization? How do you know what the use of this was beyond its functional use if you don't know enough about this civilization? So you either have to fit it into a larger pre-existing assumption or know what it was from the get-go and then find the discovery. And this is a daily kind of grind.
I love that. Let's apply that lens to where we are right now. So, we've just seen another round of indirect talks between Washington and Tehran yesterday, the third round. When diplomacy is indirect, what does that signal strategically?
Well, I think strategically it should signal one big ideological thing, which is that even at this point in time, the governments of the Islamic Republic will not sit down with the United States of America. Now, I actually think in general, at this point in time, 46, 47 years later, particularly after the protests that we saw in January 2026, sitting down with the Islamic Republic is quite possibly the worst thing because it would be seen as legitimization. But at the same time, the regime is the one who actually fears the legitimization effect of sitting down, talking with America. And that's because this regime, and in particular Khamenei, the supreme leader, has been saying for so many years, there will never be a war, nor will we negotiate with America. Then it turned out, yes, there was a war, and now they are negotiating with America. And conversely, I think there's another Khamenei quote, again, like, we know these quotes off the top of our heads because we've seen it in the press so often, reiterated and re-upped. But this is what I mean, by the way, to your previous point about having the expert, like the digging. No one likes to spend their life reading Khamenei quotes, but this is the utility of it, just for the purposes of the profession rather than the question. But then for the other side, Khamenei has also said anyone who does negotiate with America doesn't know the ABCs of politics. So the regime is clearly in this bind. It's a bind of its own making. I think the fact that it's indirect, but also the fact that it's continuing and it's continuing from political to technical kind of is a problem for me because you can't have a technical negotiation if you don't have a broader political contour. So I am very worried about what just happened in this last round. The Iranians were very optimistic. Americans were a little bit more tight-lipped and somewhat more cautious, but they weren't as negative as before. But at the same time, it looks like the military option, the logistics for that to be carried out, continue to be implemented in the region. You're seeing more assets flow in. You're seeing actual calls just today. We're recording on a Friday. Several embassies drawing down notices for people to leave the country. This is actually a very contradictory signal. But what it means to me is that the Islamic Republic and America together actually share a couple, moral equivalents aside, a couple of attributes. Number one, they're both at least signaling an interest in some kind of diplomatic outcome. Number two is they both are trying to be the one to get the other side to leave the table first. And number three, while they remain at the table, in the physical world, they're preparing the battle space. The regime is hardening sites, rebuilding some things. Meanwhile, America is flowing more forces into the region. So it's very interesting, the symmetry and also the commentary now. The commentary that they remain committed to, constructive talks, but then leaders saying that they're not afraid of the exit option of potentially a conflict emerging. So all in all, the fact that they're in direct talks is a problem for me as an Iranian American, particularly because it comes on the back end of these protests. But on the flip side, looking at this strategically, you see the bind that the regime is in ideologically, even at this point in time, as it's painted itself into a corner. And then you actually see how the foreign policy behavior of two very different states, at least in the very short term, is mirroring each other when it comes to this issue of diplomacy.
You mentioned technical level negotiations, if Washington is demanding zero enrichment and dismantlement of sites like Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, what is realistically left to negotiate at a technical level?
To me, the most important thing is even before these conversations should have commenced, it should be the IAEA going back to Iran. And that should be something that the Islamic Republic should not charge us in the West for. It shouldn't be, okay, you give me sanctions relief, then the IAEA can go back and do the monitoring mission that it should have been doing unimpeded anyway. The second question is, it gets to the heart of what you are saying. If it is zero enrichment and dismantlement, we shouldn't be negotiating about that. And the contours are, here's how we proceed to dismantlement. That is what should be negotiated over. The problem is the Islamic Republic has not accepted the political principle of zero enrichment. It remains to be seen what it does with those sites. I mean, it is an open question as to how you shutter a site that you've already bombed. And in particular, given that there is no new enrichment at these sites, the activity that you're looking to stop is the hardening and the rebuilding. So your question gets at the heart of the fundamental problem we are in here. There is still, unfortunately, more nuclear infrastructure. They're not enrichment sites, or at least they're not declared enrichment sites. But there's a host of centrifuge production sites that I would like to see shuttered as well under the rubric of dismantlement. They don't get mentioned a lot, but I think that that is at least part of the list of concerns that we have here in the States. The flip side is, given that you can't get big political agreement, there is no real way to square the circle technically, even if the Islamic Republic wanted to play ball on some of those other issues. And so I do fear here that they will talk about, okay, we won't give up the principle, but you don't recognize the principle, but we will simply not enrich for a duration of time, and then we'll revisit that issue, which actually, that whole kicking the can down the road thing, that was one of the reasons why Trump left the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal in the first place, because of this thing called sunsets, where you phase out the restrictions, which allows the Islamic Republic the opportunity to phase up or scale up its infrastructure. So my fear is they say we close these sites permanently, and then we give you a 10-year ban on something, and then you let us build a new site under that. That resurrects the same problem.
What you just mentioned makes me wonder, when demands are absolute, 0% enrichment, does that make the talks more about positioning than compromise?
This is an excellent question, meaning, is there even a utility to it? And if it's for positioning, is it to say we tried diplomacy before going to a different direction? That seemed to be the way President Trump was moving in 2025. Conversely, in this world, the utility for the Iranians is to try to delay an attack or deter an attack through talks, and also to buy time to actually, again, engage in the base hardening and the rebuilding. And also, this is less discussed, but for the Islamic Republic to get a political win out of this. And unfortunately, the political win that they can get, and we're now, again, a month past the protests, is that the government that promised help as being on the way is now seen as being more interested in negotiating with the regime that was doing the repression rather than the people who the help was promised to. And this is one thing that, unfortunately, cleverly, the Islamic Republic is doing. Through its indirect and limited engagement, it is trying to signal back home to the population that, hey, you know that guy who was trying to help you? He's more interested in talking to me. And the goal of this strategically is the Islamic Republic knows it cannot fight a two-front war. I don't mean in the region, but I mean a foreign military attack coupled with major domestic street pressure, street protests, popular pressure, social pressure, that kind of thing. And
Absolutely.
this logic, unfortunately, it's very cold logic, but it's precisely why after the 12-day war, Iran arrested 21,000 people just on trumped up charges, even for liking some pro-American or pro-Israeli posts on Facebook. That marginal of a charge, even on suspicions, when they had people at these checkpoints inside Tehran, they were arresting people. But the logic behind what they were doing was they just lost majorly a military conflict. They know that traditionally when authoritarian states lose a major military conflict, there is going to be a social crisis. So they began these mass arrests to stave off the social crisis because they know that, again, they can't fight a two-front war. So you fast forward now similarly to the January protests. Once the demography of the protest changes, once the geography of the protest changes, once the regime, because sometimes it tries to let these protests burn itself out, like we saw during Women Life Freedom, there were many times when there was mass crackdowns, and then there were also many times when security forces would withdraw to tire the protesters leave the city. The next day in the morning, the city would look like the government runs the city, but in the night, it looks like the protesters run the city. Then the next day in the morning, the government runs it. Then they would try to tire out the protests of coming and going, coming and going. And when this tactic didn't work in the January protests, and everybody from the exiled crown prince to President Trump was talking about having the support and then also getting the volume of people on the streets, the Islamic Republic said mass domestic protests will have a contagion effect, and that contagion effect will be there will be foreign military pressure soon. So
Right.
one reason I believe that the regime shot so many people so fast was because they actually thought, actually, per Donald Trump, help is on the way. The cavalry is coming. And they were trying to, again, even the scales in the most brutal way possible. So now that the regime sees the military hardware coming closer to them, now that they hear everything the White House is saying, everybody else is saying here in Washington, they hear it and they see it and they know a conflict is coming. What they're trying to do is say, okay, we will absorb the cost of the conflict. We will fight. We'll probably lose, but we can't afford after the conflict again to have our defeat of a foreign against a foreign adversary instigate or reignite those major social tensions and protests that we just put down. And that's the position I think that the regime is in now. And that's precisely why they are, as you said, talking indirectly to the negotiators, even though they have zero sum demands, is because they are trying to stave off a potential contagion effect of protests in the event of the resumption of hostilities. And this logic, again, unfortunately, these guys uh, can limp along. They don't need to win, they just need to survive. And this is part of their political strategy.
Yeah, we have seen this story, before many times. Historically, Tehran has used negotiations to buy time. Based on the patterns you have studied, are we watching that again? Many people believe that's the same game they're playing now.
I agree. And per the previous point, I think they're buying time first to deter an attack and impede it, raise the cost of it politically. Second is on the kinetic and on the targeting side to rebuild both their missile program and also harden nuclear and other military installations. And third, to try to prevent a contagion effect of any strike being felt on the ground and the goal being to dishearten. So for those three reasons alone, that is why the regime is engaging. The philosophy is buying time. These are the three reasons. So when the government comes and says, oh, we're trying to do this for sanctions relief, this is not at all the world of the JCPOA. This is not at all 2015. This is a much more securitized situation. So in this situation, the theory for their theory, their justification for engagement is fundamentally different.
Right. But to be fair, could Washington also be buying time for moving
Yes,
assets, building leverage, and preparing contingencies?
absolutely. Because it comes down to if you are more supportive of or more critical of the current US President Donald Trump. If you're more supportive, you could say this is a clever move to buy. If you're more of a detractor, you could say stuff wasn't in position from the get go. But either way, the president began to, whatever the political rationale, once you look at the material effect, once the president started to sink costs publicly in January, multiple times promising the help, but the force structure, the U.S. posture in the Middle East did not reflect the credibility to carry out that threat, then things began to change. So the interest in talks can be seen as a way to buy time to build up the force posture. What I would simply say politically is that that also comes with a cost for the president because every single comment he made in those 8 or 9 comments in the month of January have to do with supporting protesters rather than with the nuclear issue. So therefore, there is no nuclear off ramp you can easily take to this crisis, which is about credibility and is about how you promise support to, again, these protesters. And the president is now trying to touch that issue again by mentioning the number. 32,000 was the number that he mentioned in the State of the Union.
Right. That being said, if both sides are buying time, then the real question becomes what is the clock here? Elections, weaponization timeline, or regional readiness? What's your take on that?
It's entirely possible that the timeline or the clock is any preordained clock the president himself may have given. If the regime is buying time, then it knows that it should pay attention to at least publicly stated timelines the president has said he will allocate for diplomacy. I think it says a lot more about us as a society when Trump in early April 2025 said, "Oh, it's 2 months," and we said, "Yeah, whatever." And then literally right after 2 months, the strikes began. I think everyone was caught off guard by that, even though it was so clear and simple and telegraphed. Here in this case as well, just a few days ago, the president said 10 to 15 days. So if you are the regime and you're buying time against a very costly backdrop, against a president who has a precedent of sticking to in an almost legalistic manner, sticking to a pre-approved clock for diplomacy. So it's entirely possible that the clock for conflict is set not based on material conditions, but just on a political window that the president may have set. And one reason I would stress this window being political is that one of the trend lines in the way Trump has approached the Iran issue in 2025 is to not sink his political capital into one option. We've heard the phrase for 20, 25 years, all options on the table. But at this point in time, I would say he is the president who embodies that more so than anyone else. Because if you look at his posture in 2025, he went from sanctions to negotiations to conflict to multilateral pressure, all in 6 to 9 months against the Islamic Republic. And he didn't put all of his weight behind each one, but he tried each one. And I think that is the more flexible response approach that he is taking to Iran.
Right. Considering the scale and the amount of military assets in the region, they cannot stay here forever. And I think Islamic regime is misreading again, by not considering the time limit that President of the United States have given them.
The only caveat I would say with the force posture, certainly all the aircraft. In terms of missile defenses, it's good to have that back. I think we really have made a mistake, really since 2018, playing with bringing in, taking out, bringing in, taking out. I think we need a more permanent, advanced, high tier, low tier, mid tier air and missile defense posture in the region. In particular, theater missile defense is important when the other side is very willing to use theater ballistic missiles. And in a world in which we aren't or historically haven't been going after the production or using theater missile defense in the purpose of an operation to go after their production, to go after their arsenal, to go after their stockpile, simply because there haven't really been that many operations. There's just been the 12-day war. And obviously the 2 Israeli rounds of targeting in April and October of 2024. I think this can and should be kept there. But in terms of the carrier, not the carrier strike group, but the carrier, I want to remind the audience that there were times I think under Obama 2010 to 2013, where there were 2 carriers inside the Persian Gulf, and still we had a deterrence problem vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic.
Right. Very good point. So for people who hear 60% enrichment but don't grasp its meaning, how close is that technically to weapon capability?
So weapons-grade uranium is basically 90% purity and above. But unlike things that are linear, where 20% is 20, 60% is 60, enrichment of uranium is logarithmic. They say basically it goes up like this. Rather than being like this, it exponentially goes up like that. And why this matters is basically because 60% is much more than 60% of the work needed to get to weapons grade uranium. I think it is actually more in the 90 to 99%. Much of the effort, the Herculean effort, is 0 to 5 and 5 to 20. And that Herculean effort was indeed mastered by the Islamic Republic much earlier in the crisis. If you may remember, I think in 2010, the regime started to produce 20% enriched uranium. In 2012, they took that to Fordo, that underground fuel enrichment plant under a large mountain near Qom, on the outskirts of the city of Qom, that the U.S. Bombed in Operation Midnight Hammer.
Right.
That was a big shock because it was 20%, and 20% is the cutoff, by the way, for highly enriched uranium. So weapons grade is 90%, but highly enriched is 20% and above. And the regime, starting in April 2021, began to go to produce 60% and stockpile 60% purity. So 60% is more than 90% of the way there needed to enrich uranium. And I'll just end with this briefly. I think in 2023, if I'm not mistaken, the Iranians said it was an accident, but nonetheless, they briefly went up and down. I think it was more of a test. Iranians went to 83 point something percent, and the IEA caught them, and the Iranians gave a quote unquote credible technical explanation after, but nonetheless, the phenomenon happened. you're not going to burn your house down if you're not playing with matches every single day. You do things that come with consequences, even if we are to believe the technical explanation, which, by the way, many pro JCPOA people in this town and many quote unquote doves in this town did not believe that technical justification. That was just an amazing kind of thing to see. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because America, the only country in the world to have used atomic weapons in war, had dropped two: one uranium bomb, one plutonium bomb. The uranium bomb that the US dropped was a very simple device, very large device, obviously, but that wasn't even enriched to 90%. It was enriched to 80%, if I'm not mistaken. So
Right.
again, keep this in mind when we're talking about the lethality of the threats. Like, I have a book here. I forgot the title, but it's a skinny red book in the back by a French nuclear scientist, Therese Delpech. And the French have been hawks on this issue for quite a while. This book was produced in the mid 2000s when she passed away shortly thereafter. To think that we were at a crisis with, like, I don't know, 10, 11 bombs worth of highly enriched uranium. People did not in 2002, 3, 4 believe that it would be where we would be, and a major cataclysmic war would not have commenced. The Islamic Republic has been able, through discussing these very technical things, been able to inch along, to limp along, to fight another day, when the outright pursuit of these capabilities should have been a blaring red light for the West a very, very long time ago.
Right. Shout out to what great work FDD, has been doing for many years. Yesterday, I noticed Mark Dubowitz, posted a very practical infographic about different grades of uranium. So on X, for anyone who's interested, that's a very
Thank you so much.
interesting way of understanding that in a simple way. Thank you for
And
great work that you've
thank
been
you.
doing.
Mark, and also my colleague Andrea. Andrea joined us, I think, in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, 2019 or 2020. But she joined from ISIS, from the good ISIS, the Institute for Science and International Security, the organization run by David Albright. And she's worked there for many, many years, studied the Iranian nuclear program in depth, as well as other nuclear programs that have been given up, like South Africa and Taiwan, have a lot of important parallels. And she helped produce some of those graphics with Mark. And then with Andrea, because you used a word a little while ago that I like, dismantlement, with Andrea and a former State Department arms control attorney in March of 2025, because even though we still didn't necessarily want a deal, but we figured the president wanted a deal, we came up with a concept. And the word dismantlement doesn't even come from the nuclear world. It actually comes from the chemical weapons lexicon. So we took that word, applied it to what we would like to see with respect to, if Trump was going to pursue diplomacy, then here's what a good deal looked like. And so Andrea Ord and I got to have this monograph on dismantlement in March of 2025. But I'm just mentioning that because I think Mark and Andrea did that infographic together. And you're right, it's a very good thing to have, because the rates are actually not commensurate with the number.
Right. Behnam, for someone like you with Iranian kind of roots, it's a little bit more understandable the way you think about Iran. But for people like Mark Dubowitz and people like him, that genuinely they care about Iran, you can feel it, but the way they speak about Iran, the way they post, so
They love the
it's
people. I have to tell you, I've seen it up close and personal for 13 years. It would be hard to stay in in an organization talking about crisis and conflict if you did not see the human element. And I've seen it up close and personal so many times. And that is a saving grace, I got to tell you.
And last thing to mention about this, in one of his posts, he mentioned that he likes to travel through Iran, when Iran is freed soon. And I responded, I'd be honored to guide you through this beautiful country myself. That's
I would.
great. Okay.
I think we could all use a guide. I say it comes from Persian, but I'll say it in both English and Persian. Yeah, I've never been, but I miss it already. It's
Right.
been so much of my life personally and professionally, but just who wouldn't want to see where their family's from? I'm a proud American. I am so lucky that I'm born and raised here. When I get to travel the world for work, and that is also a blessing as well, I am honored that, like, as an immigrant, I'm born here, because I do see the situation of immigrants in other parts of the world, particularly the situation of other Middle Eastern immigrants, and it's not a great situation. And I've been able to be here to do this work. But to be able to go back to plant your feet on where for generations your family on mom and dad's side has been able to plant, where, not to make this sound dark, but where So many generations of your family have lived and died and also been buried. And for a land that has really seen so much, it resonates. And this is the thing about Iran. It encapsulates and captures not just us who are from there or other folks who are born there, but really anyone who studies it, anyone who engages with it. You can't but help but fall in love.
Right. Thanks again. There is a question that, considering the statements like what Steve Witkoff said a couple of days ago regarding 1 week away from that nuclear threshold or getting, into the bomb capability, and similar statements, what worries you more right now, a sudden breakthrough or a slow normalization of a threshold nuclear state?
It is possible to do a lot of computer modeling. It's never going to be one to one. But by the way, major nuclear powers that are declared that have nuclear weapons, they do a lot of their testing with computer modeling. So it is possible for the Islamic Republic to have gone far without, quote unquote, a mushroom cloud. There is a way in which they can announce a test without a test. So that certainly opens up concerns. And one of the few areas that the JCPOA was actually quite strong on was actually spelling out prohibited computer modeling activity, which is great, but there was no enforcement or verification mechanism for that. But they actually mentioned these computer modeling things. So one of my fears is that Iran already has the know-how of how to enrich uranium. Iran previously was interested in weaponization. My X factor is that since February 2021, there has been no continuity of knowledge for centrifuge production and manufacturing in Iran. So centrifuges are those big metal machines that spin the uranium gas. The stronger ones are made of carbon fiber and miraging steel, the weaker ones of aluminum, and they do get contaminated and they break and all this stuff. But moral of the story, if you have more advanced centrifuges, you can enrich more uranium faster and with a lesser number. So that if it's the quality of the machine rather than the quantity of the machine. And because we don't have a lot of great insight to where these things are produced and stored, and because we know the regime has the capability to put it together, my nightmare scenario is a just hitherto previously unknown small enrichment plant that is undeclared, covert. And the reason my worries grow is that Iran's declared nuclear sites, Natanz and Fordo, were once undeclared nuclear sites. So the preference to cheat is there, the pathway is there, uranium enrichment via gas centrifuge, and then finally that we spent all this time talking about verification and monitoring, but for declared sites, what if there was always just a small stockpile of uranium? That is what keeps me up at night. It is not that they tomorrow can go extract what they have at Natanz because then we'll bomb them. It is, did they have a small secret plant all along? And was there, because we can't guarantee the peaceful use of this material in Iran, given again, the lack of the continuity, the lack of the monitoring, the lack of the information about the chain of custody of the uranium in this country? Well, there is a chance. Like it's a low chance, but there is a chance. And if you are Khamenei, if you are the IRGC, that chance, that covert pathway becomes a heck of a lot more attractive for you after 12-day war, after the cycle of violence in the Middle East. And so that is the worries that the defeat like that can come. But even then, I think that the job of activists and analysts is not done, but it is a major, major, major setback. Yes, if the world's foremost state-sponsored terrorism gets nuclear weapons, but particularly from this pathway, that would be a setback. Yes, and that worries me.
So, last question regarding uranium. Is there any proof that they haven't moved over 60%, 400 kg, 60% enriched uranium, and they haven't turned that into 90%, which is not that difficult technically? Is there a proof that they haven't done that?
The proof would be all based on, or even the allegation, conversely, would be all based on, does one believe they moved it before the bombing? That how you come down on that question answers the question of proof. If one believes that some of the trucks we've seen near Natanz was designed to divert, that's what it's called, a diversion of fissile material from a declared facility to an undeclared, like one of those smaller facilities that I mentioned that
Right.
they may have, then we are in a very dangerous world, and we don't We don't know. And particularly because the IEA is there. But I think it's somewhat more likely. Again, it's better to be pessimistic than optimistic. But here I think the trend line, also based on the way America has been talking about it, the behavior is that we destroyed the declared uranium enrichment facilities. And the uranium that was there is now in tombs. The facilities collapsed on itself. So when Trump says the strike is successful, it is successful at basically because the facility is no longer there. The fissile material, I believe, if we're assuming, is there or perhaps in tunnel storage at the Esfahan facility, which was also struck. Either
Right.
way, I believe if we're coming down on one of these two sides of the aisle, I believe it's more likely that it's the second than the first, because the first would be immensely risky for them. Yeah, I'm not saying it wouldn't be strategic, but it would be immensely risky for them. And the second is that I feel like it would raise more alarm bells post strike in Western policy rather than the kind of victory lap that we have seen be taken.
Right. Negotiations don't happen in a vacuum. They sit on a top of military reality. We have seen reports of U.S. personnel repositioning in the region. When that happens, what a stage of escalation are we realistically in? And you also mentioned embassies reduce staff, but commercial flights continue. How should we interpret that signal? Is that precaution or preparation?
I think it's precaution and preparation at the same time. There's a lot of stuff that we've seen flow into the region that could function just as, honestly, good old fashioned military containment, aka the Trump administration has a maximum pressure policy. It is now bringing more assets in theater to magnify the effect of this containment policy. The second one is a sort of Damocles effect, which is interesting because the regime elites in Iran are actually worried about this. It's that they bring the assets into the theater with or without sufficient logistics, and they keep them into the theater, and that it allows Trump in now or in time 2, 3, 4, or Trump plus Israel now or later on to turn on and turn off the threat of credible military force against the Islamic Republic. So the option B is you bring all this stuff and park it there, and that gives you a strategic pathway to begin to bargain much more coercively with the Islamic Republic. And really, when you're bargaining each time, it's not I'll give you this and you give me that. It's you give up that and you get to live tomorrow, like that kind of bargaining. And then the third option, I think, is the logistics, the preparation, and in particular, if there's one image that comes to mind that defines this logistics, this preparation, it's not the two carrier strike groups. For me, it's the refueling aircraft, the KC-46 and the KC-135 at Israel's airports, Ben Gurion Airport. These American planes, gigantic big planes based on Boeing civilian airliners that can do mid-flight aerial refueling, both for American and for Israeli jets, giving so many more sortie power, both to America and to Israel, that would significantly maximize the range and the kind of overflight capability for these two countries that we saw a bit of during the 12-day war. So for those purposes alone, it's not just signaling; it's the logistics of war, and it's the logistics of modernized, mechanized 21st century war.
Right. So there are also reports of advanced U.S. drones operating near the Strait of Hormuz. Before this conversation, there was an unverified report. I don't know if it is verified now that one of the advanced, drones is missing, gone off the radar after receiving an emergency report. So if that's true, how significant would it be?
It depends on the type of drone, especially if it's a reconnaissance drone or a unmanned combat aerial vehicle. The Islamic Republic is interested in those. It has modeled some of its own ISR and UCAV drones after Western drones that it has shot down before. We came pretty close to a crisis with Trump and Iran back in June 2019 when they shot down an American drone over international waters, and it looked like there was going to be a major escalation. But when you mentioned drones in the region, I just wanted to mention this because I didn't see the story that you were referring to. Was it in the Persian Gulf or was it in Arabian Sea or Red
Yeah,
Sea
south of
or
Iran, near the strait.
near the Strait? Okay,
Yeah,
I have to check that out. And then the other
right.
thing I want to mention while we're on drones is today I saw a story that was saying the American version of the kamikaze drone, the American version of the Shahed drone, is operationally ready for the CENTCOM war. And so I don't remember if the piece said it was coming to the theater or will come to the theater or could come to the theater, But I just thought, that's very interesting. Like, poison, meet your poison,
Absolutely. I think it's called, the Scorpion Strike Group, something
Scorpion
like
strike,
that.
yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Does Tehran fundamentally fear military confrontation, or does it calculate that Washington will ultimately step back?
I think, especially if we're talking about Khamenei as Tehran, and there's a way to divide this, but I think at this point in time, we are living in the big social science study because for many years, the previous one that we were living in was, will Khamenei, like Khomeini, drink from the poison chalice? Is there an equilibrium? Is there a point where his domestic elite plus economic issues, social issues, and military defeat can bring him to do a 180 on a previously set element of security policy? And that was really governing the carrots and sticks approach under different administrations to different degrees for about 20 years in DC. But I think given how far Khamenei has escalated and doubled down and played to the edge, I think we're living in a new world, which is how much of the country is he going to make you burn through to get him? And in that world, when Khamenei, and in particular, the elite around him, see America through the lens of this new discourse of restraint on a part of the American right, I believe that they believe that there is a clock that will cap or a price point that will spook American military action in Iran. And that will mean that American military action, despite being very dangerous and very impactful, will be limited. And so I think the position that these guys are in is to roll the dice on military strikes and either absorb or escalate. But I think that now we can say that they fear capitulation politically more than conflict, which is a really damning thing to say out loud.
Right. So, in that case, if limited strikes were ever ordered, would they likely focus on nuclear infrastructure, the remaining ones, missile systems, or IRGC leadership?
I believe that Israel has a limited military option against the Islamic Republic. And in a much larger mix of policies, America too could entertain that. But I don't see either of the two being able to use limited military force to achieve a political win with Iran. All they could achieve would be simply to degrade the regime. And I think that both with the disposition and inclination of the Iranian people, which is just the irony of that situation, is Iran is home to the most anti-American government and anti-Israeli government, but the most pro-Israeli population and the most pro-American population in that part of the Muslim Middle East. So we, rather than have to social engineer people to like you, we already have one organically. And so therefore the policy prerogative becomes, how do you not lose that population? How can you hold that population? How can you shepherd that population? And limited war is something that Iranian territory has not faced. So for better or worse, that was one of the successes of the Islamic Republic post Iran-Iraq war, to avoid a kinetic conflict coming back onto its own territory. And I'm saying this because I think the regime would fear a go big or go home military type of option. And I think the regime would fear the contagion effect of social protest after military action. But if military action from either of these actors is likely going to be limited, it is more likely going to focus on the state threats and the military capabilities that these guys possess. And that is the spectrum of long range strike, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones. So I could see limited military force more likely on balance being applied to missile storage facilities, missile bases, and missile production centers, as well as sites and capabilities associated with the launch or transfer of these systems. So that means, the chains of bases Iran has in the west, in the center, in the east, from Tabriz to Bakhtaran to Khorramabad, from Qom to Shiraz to Isfahan, all the way to Yazd, and then in the south, Hajiabad and Jam and Lar and all these other sites, or production, Khojir, Semnan, Shahrud, all these Parchin, all these other places where they've had a role in production. I could see these things being the target of limited military force, because then the use of military force can politically take a win when there's a military win. So people can say you launched the operation because you degraded the military capacity by destroying the launchers, by collapsing the bases, by entombing the missiles, and robbing the regime of its most powerful deterrent, which is ballistic missiles. This is the logic, I think, of limited war. I think there is a chance, though, that Trump may look at something like Venezuela and may be interested in decapitation. But I think fundamentally the Iranian state structure is very, very different. I think Iranian society is very, very different. And also the military capabilities are very, very different. So the West may enter with a limited war option, but it may not leave with a clean limited war. I certainly think there is the theory of it, but so much of this and the targeting is dependent on, well, what does Iran respond with and how does Iran respond at all?
So if the ultimate, purpose is regime change, as some senators mentioned, if U.S. strike, it has to lead into regime change. And what targets, of course, to facilitate for Iranian people, for protesters, to get back to the streets, so definitely it needs to be done that way. Uh, there is a need for new targets to be added. In that case, what do you think those targets would be?
I think here we have a conception of what the targets could be. We can analytically deduce that, but just before theoretically, we have to remember that this is very challenging because the cases for air power and regime change alone are not great. It's largely Japan, which the intervening variable is the dropping of nuclear weapons and the threat of Soviet invasion. Yugoslavia, where the background is, yes, there was a genocide, and also at the same time Serbia looks very different today, but at least Bosnia likes America. And then Libya, where there was decisive air power NATO mission, but it followed armed resistance, which kind of led to the country being fractured as it is today. So theoretically, the literature and the cases aren't great for air power can equal regime change, but I think the empirics of our current situation, the Iranian situation, are different enough where it should be warranted or it should be at least tried. And in that case, air power would move from targeting air defense, military and missile sites, and even nuclear sites to political institutions naturally. And this is, again, kind of troublesome to say, but it would have to be followed by a significant intelligence campaign against the command and control to kind of immobilize national security decision making at the 1, 2, 3 levels, and then lower and slower air power. This is not something you take a B-2 to. This is something that cruise missiles, A-10s, and drones actually achieve for you, which is to drill down and to get every unit that does this repression to either face strikes, street pressure, or kind of fracturing. And the fracturing would actually happen from the bottom rather than the top, because in a situation where there's street pressure and military pressure, the incentive is for individual survival and atomization rather than for unit cohesion and loyalty. So you want to make sure that the security forces face this pressure near simultaneously as possible. And that'll be, again, very hard to pull off because timing the return of street pressure with this is going to be very, very difficult. But nonetheless, that is the theory of the case. If you're applying air power, here's what you have to see. You have to embolden the protester to go out onto the street. And the types of activities, the types of things that could make it safer for the protester to go on the street is the gutting of command and control and is the drilling down of those who engage in national security decision making such that the state is paralyzed and that some symbolic things are struck. Everybody's talking about will Trump go after Khamenei? In so many ways, if we are conceiving of this as a campaign rather than an operation, but just to get to the imagery of war for a second, it is more important that Khamenei's bait, the office, not exist than Khamenei to not exist. The imagery of that is very critical if you are trying to use street air power to drive street protests, to be able to pincer security forces so you can drill down and they can force defections from the bottom. That's
Right.
the theory of the case. And that's why these would be the type of security force targets that the US or whoever would go after. But again, we have to be humble given the challenges and given the lethality of this regime. I mean, this is a regime that we just saw lethality from on a scale unprecedented, not just for itself, but for the past 1, 2 centuries of contemporary Iranian history.
All great points you mentioned. Thank you for sharing that. You've done deep work on Iran's missile doctrine, which often gets less public attention than the nuclear file. Why are ballistic missiles so central to Tehran's long-term strategy?
Well, this is one I feel like we could do a podcast on. This it deserves its own.
Right.
But there's almost a mystical and mythical quality to ballistic missiles for Iran because this was the main tool that earned it pauses in the war fighting with neighboring Iraq. Yes, it had significantly better and more advanced air power, but the number of those air missions diminished after the Artesh played less of a role after 82 and after the Iranians moved the conflict more so onto Iraqi territory, and then the IRGC played more of a role from the ground. But Saddam's Scuds were answered with Iranian Scuds, which he tried to go to Syria, but it ended up being Syria, Libya, North Korea, ended up being the three countries that helped establish or give the capabilities and the know-how for Iran to develop its own missile command. And given the ability of the regime to engage in long-range, not so precision, but long-range precision strikes, to be able to engage in deterrence by punishment, this became the backbone of Iranian security thinking post-Iran-Iraq War and into the Cold War, deterrence by punishment. And the tools became long-range strike, and of the most important one was ballistic missiles. And because ballistic missiles can function as weapons of terror, can function as precision strike systems, and can function as WMD delivery vehicles, it becomes a much cheaper alternative to air power, which due to financial issues, sanctions, export controls, and also just the logistics of maintaining this architecture, ballistic missiles became the weapon of choice for the Islamic Republic. And I'm not at all shocked that they're fighting to keep it. And I'm not at all shocked that this is the one thing they've been throwing state resources into. And we've been seeing the regime improve not just the quantity, but the quality of these systems. The old trend lines of the Middle East was the good guys have jets, the bad guys have Scuds. A lot has changed now. Iran's missile advances have forced other people to become interested in missiles as well as forced a lot of other countries, particularly U.S. allies, to have to spend more to invest to counter this whole spectrum of unmanned aerial threats, mortars, rockets, drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. Iran has mastered that unmanned aerial threat spectrum, and its most potent and politically important weapon in that spectrum are ballistic missiles.
Right. Thank you so much to explain a lot of information, such brief moment, but precise
Thank
to
you.
the point. Thank you. So, Behnam, if a nuclear deal any kind were achieved, but missile capabilities remained untouched, I believe it creates kind of delay for different crises. Do you think such scenario is possible?
Unfortunately, we saw exactly that happen from 2013 to 2015, negotiations that led to the JCPOA deal. And the saving grace or the talking point of the administration then was, don't worry about this being a WMD delivery vehicle because our deal addresses the WMD. Well, their deal didn't necessarily address the WMD in perpetuity. It just kicked the can down the road on that issue. So it's hard to have an arms control agreement where you ignore and you carve out the arm from the threat that you seek to control. So just by that logic alone, if you're even just having a nuclear only deal, which is something that we would not recommend, but nonetheless, if that's the approach being taken, by the way, you're going to have to deal with the delivery vehicle for a nuclear weapon because a nuclear weapon is composed of three parts: the fissile material, the weaponization, and the delivery vehicle. And it's hard to ignore that one leg of this triad when you're trying to stop somebody from developing an actual nuclear weapon. And then I would just simply extend one problem when you transpose this logic onto negotiations, which is in an era where there is little trust and an era when verification is so politicized that there will be the temptation to settle for something political rather than something physical. So in a world in which there are discussions over Iran's ballistic missile program, what the regime may do is say, and they have said for many years, we have a cap on our missile range. They say our cap is 2,000 kilometers, but that's not a technical cap. That's a political prohibition that could be scaled up and scaled down. And you've had Revolutionary Guard officers, some of whom are no longer on this planet, threaten Europe for many years, saying, if you don't behave, we will scale up our missile range. So clearly, promises that the regime gives about its current capability that are entirely rooted in politics aren't worth the paper that they're written on. So my fear here is that the regime will say, we will not transfer any of these systems. Well, that's a political promise. We need a mechanism to verify. The regime can say, we simply won't test this class of missile. but will you still produce this missile? We need the whole art of getting a missile agreement, which, by the way, raises the question of, is this even worth paying for? Because we're in a world now where it'll be costly, but the 12-day war opened the question to at least be asked academically, is it worth paying even for changes? There's a whole theoretical and practical debate of, can you change this regime's foreign policy? I think you and I have similar views on that. But in a world in which we have an administration here which is interested still, after all this time, in trying, well, then the question is, if you're going to be getting something from them, is it worth giving the sanctions relief? And I think we would also say no. Well, then that moves us back into the limited war option, because I think President Trump tried to get the enrichment from them. They stalled, they dragged their feet in 2025, and then they had enrichment taken away. So one thing that could improve, perhaps not the chances of a missile deal or the chances of a good nuclear deal, but that could just improve in relative terms our bargaining power, is just this phrase from the president, which is to say, or he should say, that which you don't give me for free, I will take away from you. So if you don't give this to me at the negotiating table, on the battlefield, I will take it from you, and you will pay dearly for it. That's basically it sounds, forgive me, very, machismo, and almost, there's a Persian phrase here, I'm sure you're thinking the same thing, golduri, like it almost sounds like bullying. But we are at the point where the U.S. can demand some of these things, not because it may have international law on its side, but because the threat from the Islamic Republic is real. And unlike other threats, we should not permit it to keep growing and have to deal with it at time 7 of the crisis, when we have the capability, and I would argue the responsibility, to deal with it at time 2, 3, 4 of the crisis. I give you one
Yeah.
example just about limited military force that perplexes me. We're having this conversation about limited military force in 2026 after seeing the application of it successfully in 2025. But in the Bush administration, which was perceived as being super hawkish and all of this stuff, the Bush administration not only did not, for fear, prescribe or sanction the IRGC in its entirety as a terrorist organization, but even when its own warfighters were being killed by Iranian IEDs, and we knew the copper complex that was furnishing the copper for these IEDs that were killing over 600 Americans and coalition forces in Iraq, there was no kinetic action taken against that. That is actually an unprecedented level of restraint. I think I even remember from 2005 or 6 or 7, the name of the complex. I think it was revealed to be Sad Cheshmeh Copper Complex in Iran. I could see a very easy world in which, like, a Nixon administration would not talk about this issue, but would just cruise missile strike that copper complex, and that's it. That kind of application of limited war. And there is a world in which President Trump may begin to see, in a world in which the regime is going to be so implacable and so obstinate when it comes to giving up anything missile related, that may pave the pathway for similar kind of limited operations against Iranian missile capability and capacity. But nonetheless, unless you go big against it, the regime will respond. And then we're in, again, a cycle of escalation that who knows what the strategy is. But if past is prologue, Donald Trump only likes diplomacy, and Donald Trump only likes military action that is short, sharp, and decisive. So this is an X factor here as to this armada that he's brought closer to Iran, as well as to how long will he stay at the negotiating table.
Fantastic. So in the equation of potential upcoming military conflict, where do you put Iran's proxies, which are either decimated or weakened seriously? Whether it's a long campaign or a limited strike, where do you put their role?
I am less concerned about that than I think I would have ever been. The Houthis are probably the one that I am most concerned about. They are the ones who have the most significant maritime destructive capability and long-range strike capability. Out of all of them, the Iraqis are the one I am worried about least in an integrated fashion, but on an individual fashion, that's the one I'm most worried about, because of politics, because of U.S.-Iraq politics, because the potential spiral effects of them launching and us going after them, and the way that affects the Baghdad-Washington relationship. But if you take that political element out of it and you're just looking at military capabilities, the Houthis is the one I'm most concerned about. I know some in Israel are more concerned about the Hezbollah threat, but my answer would be, in the aggregate, the axis is down but not out. it is entirely plausible that if they see the operation against Iran widening, that they enter. But also conversely, it is logical to see that they would try to only gradually widen to also preserve options for themselves in a case where there's an operation that destroys their patron entirely. So this is the logic of how proxy hedges against the patron when the patron is in trouble. But because the proxy is already so battered and bruised, it doesn't have a lot of leverage and it doesn't have a lot of great ground to stand on. And I think that's a good thing because for too long, Iran has tried to use these weapons in war zones as a conventional shiv against us.
Right. Now, let's zoom out from tactics and talk about outcomes. If you could design the optimal outcome from this moment forward, what would it look like as an analyst that you have depth of knowledge about what's going on?
The optimal outcome is to nest whatever element of U.S. statecraft, whether that's diplomacy, sanctions, military, whatever, into a strategy where the end state is not just a non-nuclear Iran and a stable Middle East, but the end state is flipping the script on the Ayatollahs and turning Iran from adversary to ally. That has to be the long-term end state. The means to that end is regime change. And that is, I understand, is politically loaded and it's costly, but I would put to you that the opposite of that, the containment approach, has also been lengthy, has been costly, has been somewhat less effective. I mean, I'm happy to keep running the experiments, but I think we're going to keep getting the same result. And also, more importantly, I would say we have the situation on the ground in Iran where the dynamic to flip the script and the eagerness to flip the script and the willingness to help in the flipping of the script is there. And again, remember when I said the pro-American constituency in Iran is something that should be shepherded and held onto and cared for rather than wasted? This is the time to be able to benefit from that rather than just keep it there and just admire it, because that will atrophy so long as the Islamic Republic continues to act in this fashion. So I would fashion a strategy that is thinks of the use of military force not as operation, but as a campaign and as a larger series of campaign that degrades and defangs the military capabilities, destroys the air defenses, collapses the missiles in the actual bases that they're in so they can't be used. By the way, lest we forget, hardline pro-regime people after the Women Life Freedom movement said that if there was a state collapse and like a foreign state was attacking, they said that they would use missiles against their own people. Against, they would say, even that little place that you got, we would, instead of trading away our missiles, we would fire it at that location. So to defang the regime actually is to pave the pathway for the protesters and then design a campaign and work with the Iranian opposition to be able to go against the security forces and also kind of get volume in the streets. Because in the absence of local cells, in the absence of actual armed on the ground things, and I know as Iranians that's not what we might want to think about, in the absence of that, the only thing that can overcome the state is mass by the street. You need mass and then you need air power. These two together. And to design low intensity air operations that basically provide close air support for these kinds of crowds the next time that they're out there, and then be able to also degrade that security apparatus, not just in Tehran, but across all major urban centers. And the goal is to get to a position where the security forces, it's not about elite defection, it's about security force defection. You want to cause instability in the security forces, and then you want that instability to be only resolved by if they join the masses. Remember, February 11, 1979 is Revolution Victory Day for Iran, not because Khomeini did something special, but because that's the day Artesh declared neutrality. You need to get the armed forces offside. And that is the thing that can pave the pathway to actually rebuilding Iran. But I would design an entire strategy with the end state to be non-nuclear and politically to flip the script to get this place to become a partner of the West, of America, of Israel. And then the ways and the means are the coercive and the punitive. And I understand that's costly and I understand that's dangerous. But I would simply say 47 years of trying to respect stasis has not gotten stability either.
I love that. What is the single biggest strategic mistake Washington could make right now?
I would actually say it is an agreement with the Islamic Republic. It is to bail out this regime. It is to have the imagery of the regime and the Trump administration coming to some kind of an off ramp here together that would sell out the Iranian people. I mean, to think about this, Donald Trump in his first term killed Qasem Soleimani, Iran's chief terrorist. 10 years before that, in 2010, Soleimani, this was reported in 2013, but he said it in 2010. He was talking to an Iraqi official. Soleimani reportedly said, "We're not like the Americans. We don't abandon our friends." If after all this time, if after all this commentary, if after all this stuff in support of the Iranian people, which I would actually argue is not socially engineered, it is recognizing the potential and the capital and the capability and the partnership that can exist, not just to free people because free people, that's a good, dignified thing to do and that's a moral thing to do, but because of the opportunities that exist for America to do that because it's good for you too. Soleimani said that line about Americans abandon their friends. 10 years later, Trump targeted him in that drone strike. Now, 6 years later, our policy should not be something that vindicates the Soleimani talking point. You know, don't vindicate him in death. Don't prove him correct many years later that that we don't care about our friends. That would be truly damning. And unfortunately, that would add this to the list of crises. Thank God, not long, but unfortunately, it does exist of times where the U.S. did lean in, and then all of a sudden it leaned out. There would be a different debate if you didn't even lean in at all. But if you lean in, like 56 Hungary or 91 Iraq, and you encourage and you support and you promise, and then you don't deliver, it's not just the moral hazard, which is grotesque, that is there. It's the contagion effect. You know, it correlates, and it's hard to prove that it's an exact causation, but I think it's closer to causation than many folks appear to understand. But weakness is contagious, particularly in an era of great power competition, and particularly when you have adversaries like the Islamic Republic, but also China and Russia that play to the edge. Less than 1 year after President Obama didn't defend his red line in Syria, Russia invaded Crimea. Less than one
Right.
year after the way we left the airport and the embassy in Baghdad, in Kabul, in that fashion, Russia invaded Ukraine. We can't afford to keep creating these images in the minds of our adversaries and think that, oh, we don't care about the Middle East, we don't care about whatever, we can pivot and just deal with the big issues. There's no straight line from losing to the small actor and winning against the big actor. And the big actor is watching how you perform against the small actor. And I know that there's a whole different series of theories that talk about the credibility and the level of interest. Oh no, if we have a crisis with Taiwan, well, that's separate and that's about our interest with Taiwan. No, China is making inferences right now about American resolve, right now. So the biggest mistake is to give this regime, which by the way has a bounty on the president's head, has tried to kill Americans and dissidents and other folks on U.S. soil. It remains the world's foremost state-sponsored terrorism. The strategic case alone against the Islamic Republic is an open and shut damning case. But to use your diplomatic muscle to give them time, that I think is a real own goal of epic proportion.
Right. So, this is a very credible question. I also asked this on X myself that, what message does it send, to Russia and China if US back down and make a deal uh, with Islamic regime? Not only that, what message it sends to allies and rogue regimes, like North Korea, so because the US military is built for a reason. If they make a deal with Iran with this situation at its weakest point, and so the military that they have, then there is there is a lot to say, and hopefully we do not see that mistake. Want to shift from policy to something more foundational. You study power systems for a living. After all these years, how do you personally define freedom?
Freedom, I wouldn't just say it's the legal ability to do what you want or think what you want or say what you want, but I believe it is the ability to wake up one day, wake up any day and feel unconstrained. It doesn't mean that there aren't laws in America, but I wake up in America every day not feeling constrained by those laws. There are limits, there are boundaries, but those limits and boundaries aren't right up against my face every single day. They don't limit what I can do on my phone this way. They don't limit who I talk to. They don't limit who I vote for or what I want to do politically. So freedom for me is something pretty essential. It's almost borderline spiritual. So freedom is a sense, is a feeling. It's a liberating quality. Yes, there's something very practical about it. Freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of worship. Those are kinds of freedoms, but those are manifestations of it, but they come from this larger political freedom. They come from this larger kind of sense, and you kind of have to sense it. A free person, a truly free person, speaks, acts, and thinks differently than by someone who spends their life coloring in the lines and then is so concerned about coloring in the lines that, they don't even reach the lines. They just constantly miss their potential. And that's the challenge of unfree peoples, that it conditions you to never even test the line. It conditions you to always think inward.
I love that. On a personal level, after years of studying threat and conflict, what keeps you committed to this work?
You have to love it. I mean, you have to love it. I genuinely did not know when I was getting interested in Iran and studying a little bit of archaeology and just as a kid looking at ancient civilizations, and you scale that all the way up, that I would be sitting here talking about guns and bombs. I mean, my first undergrad course in college was a religion course, and now here I'm talking about guns and bombs. Like, I love to study the subject matter, everything I've learned, whether it is non-proliferation, or on the missile and military defense side, or on the econ and the sanction side, or even on the cyber side. I've learned these different functional things through the prism of just constantly wanting to live a life that is interested in all things Iran. And that's the kind of life I want to continue to pursue. Hopefully, at least here in Washington, that knowledge, however limited may be, can be of use to the policymaker, can benefit the American national interest. But it would be great if it could be benefiting the Iranian public and their good one day if things fundamentally change in that country for the better. Because I can tell you from this limited time of looking at the situation, they deserve it.
So I mentioned that before. I say that again publicly. You are a badge of honor for Iranian people. Thank you for what you've been doing.
It's very kind
So,
of you.
and
Thank you so much.
my last question, Behnam, when you hear the phrase beyond the summit, what does it mean to you professionally and personally?
Professionally, it actually reminds me of things I've heard at summits, conferences, think tank events, track twos. It's actually, quote unquote, it's where the fun begins. It's where, the academic veneer for the gathering ends and then the socialization begins. And it's not raw socialization. It's actually when people let loose and they can discuss those same exact things, but in a freer, opener, a little bit less constrained manner. That's what I think of when I think of Beyond the Summit, personally and professionally.
Thank you so much, Behnam. This was thoughtful, disciplined, and deeply important. These conversations shape how people understand risk, power, and freedom, not just in the Middle East, but globally. Thank you for bringing clarity and seriousness to Beyond the Summit.
Thank you for a great show and doing what you do. Thank you, Amir.
Thank you.